Hey guys, tonight we're talking about one of the strangest little corners of World War II history, why soldiers sometimes married complete strangers in a single weekend. You picture it now, a crowded train station in 1943, the clatter of boots against concrete, the muffled hiss of steam, and somewhere in that noisy blur, a young soldier spotting a woman across the platform. By Sunday night, they might be husband and wife. No long courting, no dinner dates, no meet the parents. Just two signatures, a kiss, and then bam, one of them is shipped halfway around the globe. You probably won't survive this story without at least one raised eyebrow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is right now. Drop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through those wartime streets as if you're one of them. Posters scream at you to do your part, ration coupons flutter in your pocket, and every man in uniform looks like both a hero and a ghost in waiting. Soldiers feel the clock ticking louder than anyone else. Imagine, your deployment notice says you've got 72 hours before boarding a troop ship. In that tiny sliver of borrowed time, you crave something solid, something human. Marriage becomes less about romance and more about clinging to life's illusion of permanence. Here's the mainstream fact. During WWII, US marriage rates surged to record highs, over 1.8 million weddings in 1942 alone. People joked that chapels worked like assembly lines, cranking out couples faster than bakeries sold bread. And yet, one quirky tidbit still floats around. Some towns reported so many emergency weddings that they ran out of marriage licenses and had to type them up on whatever paper was handy, even scrap stationery from the mayor's office. Historians still argue whether this was courage or madness. Was it noble for a man to promise fidelity hours before boarding a destroyer, or reckless, binding two strangers in vows as flimsy as the ration card paper they were printed on? The truth is, both could be true. You shuffle along in the soldier's heavy boots, meeting eyes with a young woman in her Sunday dress. She's not the girl next door you grew up with. She's a stranger who smiles back, and suddenly time bends. War has a way of smashing the brakes on slow courtship. Who cares if you haven't asked her favorite color? Who cares if her father even knows your name? You're leaving tomorrow. That alone becomes the reason. The humor slips in, too. Imagine chaplains muttering, what's your name? Take this man you just met, while keeping one eye on their watch because 3 more couples are waiting in line, or a jittery groom fumbling for a ring, pulling a string off his rucksack and hoping it'll do. Even the priests probably rolled their eyes. God bless you both, now hurry up. And through it all, you feel the paradox. Desperation dressed as devotion. It's not that love didn't exist, it absolutely did. But in that suspended weekend, love had to sprint a marathon. You barely finish your vows before war yanks you away, leaving behind a promise that might never see daylight again. The platforms, the chapels, the courthouse back rooms, they all echo with hurried I-do's. You can almost hear the nervous laughter, the quick scribble of signatures, and the sigh of 2 people convincing themselves this gamble makes sense. You drift now toward the train station, where so many of these rushed promises first began. The air smells of coal smoke and damp wool. Conductors shout schedules through tinny loudspeakers, and soldiers lug duffel bags nearly bigger than themselves. You picture yourself wedged among them, ticket in hand, orders folded in your breast pocket. You've got maybe one last free day before shipping out, and the station teems with strangers, girls in patterned dresses, mothers wrangling toddlers, shop clerks selling sandwiches in wax paper. This is where it often happened. A glance across the crowd, 2 eyes catching for just a moment too long. It sounds like something out of a cheesy movie, but wartime urgency gave those glances a gravitational pull. You lean against a pillar, pretending to study the departures board, while actually sneaking a look at someone who's doing the exact same thing. Before long, a conversation sparks, maybe about the weather, maybe about the ridiculous length of the train delays. And then it escalates, a walk down the platform, coffee at a nearby diner, laughter at jokes you both know aren't really that funny. Here's the mainstream fact. Wartime train stations became informal social hubs, often filled with USO volunteers, victory girls, and ordinary women eager to chat with men heading off to fight. Whole marriages began in these liminal spaces. Some historians even argue that the clamor of steam and whistles created a soundtrack that heightened the drama, giving every encounter a cinematic glow. Now, for a quirky tidbit, soldiers sometimes scrawled phone numbers directly onto their sleeves or onto matchbooks because paper was scarce and pens were unreliable in the damp. Imagine scrubbing your laundry later and realizing you just erased the only trace of the girl you promised to call. Oops, that's not exactly a love story for the ages. Historians still argue whether these chance meetings represented genuine human connection or just wartime theatre. Were people truly falling in love, or were they caught up in a frenzy of uniforms, fear, and the sound of train whistles that made everything feel urgent? You shuffle along with the crowd, nerves rattling in rhythm with the rolling suitcases. A soldier might lean in and whisper, "I'm shipping out tomorrow. Would you, maybe, consider meeting me at the courthouse?" And the absurdity hits you. One day, you're strangers. The next, you're debating what kind of wedding cake you can cobble together before the next train departs. There's humor hidden in the edges, too. Picture a soldier who proposes with a mouth full of sandwich bread because he knows he doesn't have time to swallow before boarding. Or imagine the girl who, in a fluster, says yes, but then can't remember his last name until the clerk asks. There's nothing like saying, Smith, maybe, in front of a baffled notary. Still, you sense the desperation humming under all the laughter. Every goodbye feels permanent when war looms. Every hello carries the weight of maybe being the last. You stand there with your cap in your hands, not sure if you're brave or just reckless, but certain of one thing: the train is leaving soon, and you don't want to ride it alone in spirit. You follow that train station spark into the days that come after, when hurried vows turn into long-distance lifelines. Once the uniforms board those troop trains and vanish into the smoky distance, what's left is paper, ink, and an aching imagination. You can almost hear the scratch of fountain pens, the clumsy blot of ink splattering across ration paper stationery. Letters become more than words. They're the pulse that keeps two strangers tied together. The mainstream fact here is undeniable. Wartime correspondence ballooned into a cultural phenomenon. By 1945, the US military postal system handled over 2.5 billion pieces of mail annually. Soldiers and their whirlwind spouses contributed stacks of them, trying to build marriages in absentia, one envelope at a time. Some GIs even measured their morale in letters per week, swearing that a 3-day drought in mail felt like starvation. But here's your quirky tidbit. Women often spritzed perfume on their letters, hoping the scent would survive a journey across oceans. Sometimes the smell lingered. Sometimes the envelope ended up reeking of diesel fuel from the cargo hold. There were also reports of cheeky pin-up cutouts tucked between folded paper, creating quite the scandal if a sergeant happened to intercept the mail. Historians still argue whether these marriages by letter created genuine intimacy or a kind of imagined one. Did two people really learn each other's souls, or did they just curate idealized versions of themselves on paper? Some scholars even suggest that the myth of the perfect GI husband and the faithful bride at home was maintained more on stationery than in reality. You picture yourself hunched over a crate in some drafty barracks, licking an envelope shut while your buddies tease you. What's her name again? Oh, right, you've only known her 3 days. The irony cuts sharp, but you don't care. That little scrap of paper feels like a shield against loneliness, as important as a helmet or rifle. There's humor in this paper romance too. Think of the poor soldier who accidentally sent 2 letters at once, each with different pet names, and the wife demanding to know why she suddenly shared her endearments with Pumpkin. Or the bride who mailed her husband a lock of hair, only for it to arrive weeks later, matted and smelling faintly like mildew. Nothing says "I love you" quite like a soggy curl. Still, the longing is real. You read her handwriting in the dim glow of a lantern, your thumb tracing over the loops and curves as if that were a caress. You imagine her at the kitchen table, ink smudging her fingertips, wondering if you'll ever read these words or if the letter will sit in a dead mail pile somewhere in Europe. And for her, waiting by the mailbox each morning feels like opening a vein of hope. It's absurd and tender all at once. Two strangers binding themselves tighter through letters than many married couples did in person. And all because of a single weekend's promise, scribbled into permanence by the relentless churn of war. You step back into the jittery energy of the 1940s when a uniform itself could tilt the scales of love, or at least infatuation. Khaki cloth, brass buttons polished to a shine, a jaunty cap tipped at just the right angle. Suddenly the ordinary farm boy looks like a movie star stepping off a silver screen. Women, weary of ration lines and endless headlines, often admitted they were swept up by the sight of a soldier standing tall in his gear. The mainstream fact here, uniforms carried more than fabric. They symbolized duty, sacrifice, and national pride. Sociologists of the time noted that women were more willing to consider quick marriages with servicemen than with civilian suitors. The uniform wasn't just clothing, it was shorthand for bravery, and oddly enough, eligibility. And now the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers took advantage of this magnetism by borrowing uniforms they hadn't technically earned. Tales circulated of mechanics donning pilot jackets to impress women, or cooks pinning on medals meant for others. You can almost picture the sheepish grin of a man who claims to be a bomber ace but actually peels potatoes all day. Historians still argue whether women were genuinely attracted to the men behind the uniforms or more to the symbolism stitched into the seams. Was it the actual soldier, or the projection of heroism that made someone say yes to a stranger's proposal? You slip into that role yourself. Tugging at the stiff collar, catching sight of your reflection in a shop window, you look taller, sharper, maybe even invincible. And when someone smiles back at you, you feel that rush of being more than who you were yesterday. The war granted instant charisma to boys who, weeks earlier, were bagging groceries or fixing tractors. Of course, comedy lurks in the details. Imagine a young man forgetting to remove the price tag still dangling from his second-hand jacket. Or the unfortunate recruit whose trousers were 3 sizes too large, forcing him to keep one hand permanently clutching his belt while trying to look heroic. It's hard to sweep a woman off her feet when your pants are slipping to your ankles. Still, you can't deny the charm. Couples leaned into this illusion, believing in the magic of pressed cloth and shining insignia. For the soldier, the uniform became a passport into fast-tracked intimacy. For the bride-to-be, it offered the sense that she was aligning herself with honor, that she was sharing in a noble cause, and together, even as strangers, they stepped forward with the conviction that a weekend could reshape a lifetime. You let the weight of that uniform settle, not just on your shoulders but in your chest, as you consider why marriage felt like more than romance during wartime. For many women, saying "I do" to a soldier wasn't simply a dreamy swoon, it was a form of protection. The world was unstable, ration coupons were tight, and the promise of being Mrs. Somebody carried tangible benefits. Married women could sometimes access larger ration allowances, or qualify for housing priorities, or even draw on small military stipends if tragedy struck. Stability was scarce, and a marriage certificate, however rushed, could feel like a ticket to survival. Here's the mainstream fact. The US government actually recognized this reality. By 1942, official policies extended benefits to soldiers' wives, meaning a quick marriage could secure a steady allotment check each month. For a young woman working long hours in a factory or on a farm, that financial anchor mattered almost as much as the vows themselves. And the quirky tidbit. Some women admitted years later that they married primarily for the ration books. One bride giggled in an interview that she and her soldier husband split the sugar coupons down the middle before he shipped out. "He got the coffee, I got the cake," she laughed, as though they'd brokered a business merger instead of a honeymoon. Historians still argue whether these marriages were transactional arrangements or earnest attempts at human connection? Was it a cynical calculus, security traded for companionship, or simply a new kind of romance shaped by wartime necessity? No easy answer sticks because the motives tangled together like yarn in a knotted ball. You picture yourself in that crowded courthouse, a judge flipping through forms while the bride clutches her handbag like it's her only anchor. Outside, the war sirens wail during an air raid drill. The bride thinks, if he dies tomorrow, at least I'll have something left. At least I'll be his widow, not just some girl who waved goodbye. And the soldier thinks, if I don't make it back, someone will carry my name forward. Humour threads through this grim calculus too. Imagine a soldier trying to explain to his new wife how to fill out a complex military allotment form, only for her to confess she's never balanced a checkbook in her life. Or the bride who writes her address on the paperwork, then sheepishly adds, but sometimes I stay with my aunt and sometimes I'm at my cousin's, so good luck finding me. The War Department must have sighed deeply over envelopes bouncing across counties. Still, the pull was undeniable. You tuck the marriage certificate into your jacket pocket like it's both shield and sword. For the soldier, it's a reminder that someone will wait for him. For the bride, it's a sliver of protection in a world where bombs fall, sugar vanishes, and tomorrow is never guaranteed. Together, even if you're strangers, you gamble that 2 signatures can outwit a war. You shuffle now into one of the strangest sights of the era, chapels and courthouses running like wedding factories. The atmosphere was less stained glass reverence and more conveyor belt efficiency. You picture rows of couples lined up in their Sunday best, or whatever passed for best during rationing, waiting their turn like passengers boarding a bus. Priests, ministers, chaplains and judges barely looked up from the paperwork, mumbling vows as though reading grocery lists. The mainstream fact: in places near large bases, Fort Bragg, Norfolk, San Diego, Pearl Harbor, officiants sometimes performed dozens of ceremonies in a single day. Some reported cranking through 10 marriages in an hour, barely pausing long enough to ensure the right bride was paired with the right groom. Efficiency trumped sentiment. The war clock ticked too loudly to linger over romance. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Las Vegas, where quickie marriages were already a specialty, chapels boomed so loudly during the war that some advertised, marriage in 15 minutes, annulment in 20. One enterprising judge even kept his office open into the night, fueled by coffee and the occasional nip of whiskey, stamping papers like a human typewriter. Historians still argue whether this cheapened the institution of marriage or democratized it. Did the rapid-fire style strip vows of meaning, or did it show that love, or at least companionship, wasn't bound by pomp and ritual? Some scholars suggest these assembly line weddings reflected American pragmatism at its peak. Get the job done, no frills, move on. Step inside one of those chapels now. You stand shoulder to shoulder with other jittery couples, listening as the officiant rattles through the words. You don't even hear half of them, too busy glancing at your bride and wondering if she's thinking the same thing you are. Are we really doing this? Then the officiant barks, "Kiss! Next!" And before you can catch your breath, you're married, pushed toward the door, like a factory product ready for shipping. There's humour woven in, of course. Imagine a bride so nervous she blurts out her maiden name during the "I take thee" line, and the groom corrects her mid-vow. Or a chaplain accidentally recycling yesterday's ceremony notes and declaring the couple husband and husband, prompting a round of awkward coughing before scribbling in the correction. Even in solemn moments, laughter bubbled up, partly because everyone knew how absurd the pace was. Still, the effect was profound. You leave the building holding your new spouse's hand, not sure whether to laugh, cry, or ask for a receipt. The vows may have been rushed, but the paper in your pocket is real. And so is the knot now, tied between 2 people, who a week ago might not have known each other's middle names. And as you step back into the wartime night, you realize the ceremony wasn't about flowers or music. It was about beating the clock. You drift across the ocean now, following the path of the war bride phenomenon, a movement so large it reshaped immigration policies. Imagine thousands of women stepping aboard troop ships, clutching suitcases packed with rationed dresses, family photographs, and nerves knotted tighter than rope. They left everything familiar, streets where they grew up, accents they'd always heard, even the smell of their mother's kitchen, just to follow a man they'd known for a matter of days or weeks. The mainstream fact: by the end of World War II, over 100,000 foreign women had married American servicemen. British women topped the list, but French, Italian, German, and later Japanese women joined the exodus. Congress even passed the War Brides Act in 1945, allowing these women and their children to enter the United States outside of normal quotas. Ships like the SS Argentina carried thousands of brides at a time, nicknamed bride ships in newspapers. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some of those voyages became floating beauty contests. Newspapers ran cheeky headlines about brides ahoy and reported on deckside fashion shows organized by women to kill time on the long Atlantic crossing. Soldiers joked that the Navy had turned into a wedding cruise line, complete with seasick honeymoons. Historians still argue whether these marriages represented true love or wartime desperation. Were these women choosing adventure, or were they gambling on survival in a foreign land? Was it courage to step onto those ships, or a kind of reckless hope? The debate lingers because memoirs swing both ways, some glowing with stories of lasting devotion, others heavy with regret and alienation. You stand on the deck of one of those crowded ships, the salt air clinging to your lips, the horizon stretching forever. Around you, women chatter nervously in a dozen accents. Some clutch babies wrapped in wool, others twist cheap rings around their fingers, whispering silent prayers that the man waiting in New Jersey or Kansas City will actually show up. You imagine the mixture of dread and excitement swirling in every heartbeat. Humor pops up, even here. Picture a bride, seasick on her very first voyage, vowing never to cross another body of water, only to discover her new husband is stationed in Hawaii. Or the poor sailor assigned to bunk below a gaggle of giggling brides who never stopped comparing notes about their whirlwind weddings. The journeys ended in bustling ports, where photographers captured tired women stepping onto foreign soil, clutching papers like golden tickets. Some found fairy tale beginnings, welcomed into families who marveled at their accents. Others stumbled into icy receptions, where in-laws muttered about foreign girls and neighbors gossiped. Whatever the outcome, the sheer scale of the war bride movement etched itself permanently into the social fabric of post-war America. And all of it began with a stranger, a uniform, and a hurried vow whispered one restless weekend. You settle into the rhythm of a soldier's leave, the tiny windows of freedom that made whirlwind marriages almost inevitable. Picture it. A man trudges back from maneuvers, uniform dusty, eyes rimmed red, and someone thrusts a slip of paper into his hand. He's got 48 hours of leave before shipping out. That's it. No extensions, no wiggle room, just 2 short days to cram in everything he might never get again. The mainstream fact: official military policy often allowed just brief passes, sometimes only a weekend before deployment. Commanders frowned on extended leave, believing soldiers needed to stay focused on duty. This ticking clock created a sense of urgency so sharp it could cut reason clean in half. Many marriages happened not because couples thought carefully, but because they thought quickly, because the calendar bullied them into decisions. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some city clerks reported soldiers literally running into their offices minutes before closing, shouting, "Don't lock the door yet, we've got to get hitched." One judge in New Orleans joked that he felt more like a sprinter than a jurist, racing through ceremonies so the grooms could make it back to the train station on time. Historians still argue whether these rushed unions represented bravery in the face of mortality or panic in the face of deadlines. Was it heroic to seize life in a 48-hour window, or reckless to gamble futures on the flip of a calendar page? Some scholars frame it as both, a collision of courage and fear, with romance caught in the middle. You imagine yourself with those precious hours in your pocket, standing on a sidewalk with a woman you barely know. The street lamps glow like stage lights, ration coupons crinkle in your wallet, and every minute feels like sand slipping through your fingers. Do you waste time? No, you hurry to a courthouse knowing the train whistle will blow tomorrow. It's absurd, yet heartbreakingly logical in a world where tomorrow might mean combat. The humor lurks in the margins, of course. Picture a soldier stumbling into his wedding so exhausted from maneuvers that he falls asleep during the vows. Or a bride joking, "We met Friday, married Saturday, and he left Sunday. Do I file that under romance or misprint?" Wartime newspapers loved those punchlines, treating them as human interest curiosities rather than tragedies. Still beneath the jokes, the gravity presses down. Those brief passes turned men into gamblers, betting their futures on strangers' smiles. For some, the wager held. For others, it collapsed the moment the train pulled away. And you, caught in that feverish weekend, know exactly why someone would risk it all. Because 2 days of companionship, however fragile, felt infinitely better than none. You drift now into the flickering light of a movie theater, where Hollywood itself fanned the flames of whirlwind romance. Wartime audiences flocked to see silver-screen lovers falling head over heels in a single evening, sealing their fate with a kiss before the credits rolled. The dim glow of projectors and the smell of buttered popcorn wrapped viewers in the idea that speed didn't cheapen love, it dramatized it. The mainstream fact: Hollywood churned out dozens of wartime films in the early 1940s that glorified sudden marriages and love at first sight. Movies like Since You Went Away and Casablanca presented romance as something urgent, fleeting, and heightened by war. Soldiers and civilians alike soaked up those messages, leaving theaters with hearts pounding and a sense that tomorrow was already too late. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some theaters even ran victory courtship nights, pairing films with dances or meet and greets for servicemen and women. Picture ushers juggling soda cups while a jitterbug band played in the lobby, giving couples the excuse to fall in love before the second reel even started. The line between cinema and real life blurred so easily it was almost comical. Historians still argue whether Hollywood reflected existing social behavior or actively manufactured it. Did films merely echo what was already happening, young couples rushing into marriage, or did they create the cultural expectation that such haste was not only acceptable but glamorous? Some scholars insist Hollywood sold a fantasy, while others argue it simply amplified reality. You imagine yourself in that theater, the velvet seat creaking under your weight, a stranger's hand brushing yours in the dark. On screen, a soldier tells his sweetheart, "We can't wait." You turn, whispering the same line with a nervous grin, and she laughs, half swooning, half mocking. By the time the credits roll, the idea of a weekend wedding doesn't feel absurd. It feels cinematic destiny. And of course, the humor writes itself. Think of couples walking out of a double feature, so inspired that they head straight to a chapel, only to discover the groom still has popcorn kernels stuck in his collar. Or the soldier who proposed with the line, "Here's looking at you, kid," prompting his bewildered bride to ask if he was quoting or being sincere. Still, the silver screen mattered. Those glossy illusions wrapped wartime reality in glamour, giving hurried unions a cultural stamp of approval. Whether it was fantasy or foresight, the movies taught an entire generation that love wasn't something to schedule. It was something to seize before the lights came up. You step out of that movie theater glow and into the living rooms and kitchens where reality intrudes, where families grappled with the news that their son or daughter was marrying someone they barely knew. Parents clutched letters announcing engagements with equal parts pride and horror. Engaged? To who? You met him when? Friday? Brothers cracked jokes about shotguns, sisters whispered behind hands, and grandmothers shook their heads with that universal expression of kids these days. Here's the mainstream fact. Families had little real power to stop these unions. Military marriages often happened so quickly, with soldiers leaving immediately after, that objections were moot. Still, the tension was palpable. Some parents accepted the whirlwind as patriotic duty. At least she's marrying a man in uniform. Others viewed it as pure folly, convinced their child was gambling their future away. And, the quirky tidbit, some couples mailed wedding announcements to their parents after the ceremony, complete with posed studio photos taken in borrowed clothes. One bride later admitted her parents learned she was married from a local newspaper before her letter even arrived. You can almost hear the exasperated sigh echoing across the decades. Historians still argue whether families' disapproval represented wisdom ignored or simply generational lag. Were the elders right to caution patience, or were they trapped in outdated notions of courtship? Some scholars note that parents who had lived through the Great Depression understood the costs of rash decisions more keenly than their children did. Others counter that parents couldn't grasp the urgency of wartime living, where tomorrow was a promise, not a guarantee. You stand in the parlor now, facing a stiff-backed father polishing his spectacles, while your bride twists her hands nervously. The silence weighs heavier than any battlefield. He finally mutters, "Son, you've known her 3 days." You reply, "Sir, I might not have 3 more." That line, as dramatic as it sounds, often ended the argument. Humor sneaks in, though. Imagine a mother-in-law showing up to meet the new husband only to realize she can't remember his name and calls him Harold all evening when his name is George. Or the poor bride trying to explain to her parents why her groom listed her residence on the marriage certificate as Train Station Cafe Booth 2. Families might not have approved, but they couldn't resist chuckling at the sheer absurdity. Still, the rift ran deep. Some couples built marriages with a ghost of parental disapproval hovering forever in the background. Others found reconciliation years later when grandchildren softened hardened hearts. And you, stepping into that living room, know that every nod of acceptance or scowl of resistance is one more reminder. These wartime unions weren't just about 2 people. They were about entire families reshaped overnight. You linger now on the tiny details that made these whirlwind weddings possible, or sometimes almost impossible. Picture a young groom fumbling through his pockets only to realize he can't afford a ring, or that every jeweler in town has long since sold out. Gold was rationed, silver was scarce, and jewelers turned their display cases into echo chambers of empty velvet. The mainstream fact, by 1942, restrictions on precious metals meant that wedding rings were often made from cheaper substitutes like brass, nickel, or even stainless steel. Some couples settled for plain bands with no engraving, knowing they'd replace them later, if later ever came. And the quirky tidbit? In more than one case, soldiers tied literal string around their bride's finger during the ceremony, promising a real ring after the war. One chaplain later quipped that he'd married a couple with 1 shoelace between them and not a nickel for a honeymoon. Even stranger, some brides proudly wore rings hammered from scrap airplane aluminum, joking that their marriage was ready for takeoff. Historians still argue whether the lack of material glamour undermined these marriages or proved their sincerity. Were couples cutting corners out of true devotion, or were they simply swept along in a cultural wave where sentiment mattered more than permanence? Some scholars claim the shortage forced couples to strip marriage down to its bones, testing whether vows could stand without sparkle. You picture yourself in a cramped courthouse office, nervously slipping a bent brass ring, barely polished, onto your bride's finger. It pinches a little, and she laughs, insisting it's good luck. You feel sheepish, but in that moment, the absurdity dissolves into tenderness. She doesn't need diamonds, she needs you, or at least the version of you promised by uniform and paper. The humor practically writes itself. Imagine a soldier too poor for a band improvising with a soda bottle cap, only for the bride to nearly slice her finger open. Or a groom borrowing his buddy's ring for the ceremony, only to realize later that his friend forgot to take it off the next morning. Wartime weddings blurred practicality with slapstick in ways that would make jewelers weep. Still, the ring, or lack thereof, symbolized more than metal. It was a talisman, fragile but binding. You carry that brass circle like it's Excalibur, proof that someone somewhere will call you home when the shooting starts. And as the clock ticks toward deployment, the rings shine, no matter how faint, glows brighter than all the ration stamps in your wallet. You shuffle now into the dim corridors of county courthouses, where red tape often dissolved under the pressure of war. Normally, marriage licenses required waiting periods, blood tests, and endless paperwork. But in the 1940s, clerks found themselves bending rules like pretzels to accommodate soldiers with only a day or two before deployment. The mainstream fact: in many states, emergency wartime provisions allowed couples to bypass standard waiting times. Instead of a week, a license might be granted within an hour. Some jurisdictions even skipped blood tests altogether, despite laws technically requiring them. Judges, sensing the urgency, held impromptu sessions in their offices, stamping papers at midnight just to keep up. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some towns, clerks grew so accustomed to soldiers rushing in at the last minute that they kept stacks of pre-signed forms handy. One Illinois clerk joked he issued so many emergency licenses that his hand cramped worse than a factory typist's. Another courthouse ran out of official paper entirely and resorted to using scrap stationery from a defunct poultry association, meaning a few couples technically started their marriages on chicken-headed letterhead. Historians still argue whether such shortcuts were patriotic flexibility or bureaucratic negligence. Did the government knowingly bend rules for love's sake, or was it simply overwhelmed by the tidal wave of wartime demand? Some scholars claim it was compassion wrapped in pragmatism. Others mutter that it sowed chaos for divorce courts a decade later. You picture yourself bursting into a courthouse on a Saturday evening, your bride in tow, both of you breathless from sprinting. The clerk barely looks up, muttering, "Names, ages, fine, sign here." He doesn't even remove his cigarette from his mouth as he rubber stamps the paper. 10 minutes later, you're technically wed, though you're not sure either of you even spelled the names correctly. And there's humour here too. Imagine the clerk so tired he accidentally signed his own name on the groom's line, or the bride who forgot her birthday and guessed, only to discover later she'd married herself 2 years older. These stories ripple through history like comedic footnotes, reminding you how absurdly human the process really was. Still, the paper mattered. That crumpled license, ink barely dry, became both shield and shackle. You tuck it into your breast pocket as if it's armor, stepping back into a world about to fracture. And for that fleeting moment, bureaucracy bends under the weight of love, or at least under the pressure of a ticking train schedule. You step into the hush of a borrowed bedroom, the door creaking shut, the war outside pressing its face to the window. For many couples, this was it. The only night together before months or even years of separation. The room smells faintly of mothballs and cold radiator pipes, the bedspread patterned with flowers that don't quite match. In that cramped space, strangers tried to become intimates overnight. Here's the mainstream fact: countless wartime couples spent just a single night together before deployment, with some grooms shipping out the very next morning. Newspapers carried sentimental features about honeymoons of 24 hours, framing them as both noble and heartbreaking. The quirky tidbit: boarding house owners near military bases sometimes rented rooms by the hour, advertising honeymoon specials to frantic couples. One owner admitted she decorated her spare attic with paper hearts cut from old magazines, just to make the setting slightly less grim. Another story tells of a couple whose wedding night was spent in a train sleeper car, surrounded by snoring strangers and the occasional conductor stomping through. Historians still argue whether these hurried nights forged intimacy or just painted over loneliness with a thin coat of comfort. Did couples truly bond in those rushed hours, or did they merely cling to the idea of closeness before being torn apart? Some scholars claim these nights planted fragile seeds of devotion. Others believe they were symbolic gestures more than genuine unions. You lie there now, boots pushed under the bed, the muffled rumble of a distant train filling the silence. Your bride traces the outline of your hand, memorizing the shape because photographs never seem to capture it right. You whisper jokes, fumbling through laughter to mask the looming dread. Well, you murmur, if nothing else, at least the wallpaper's festive. Humour, as always, sneaks in. Imagine the soldier so nervous he saluted his bride before leaning in for a kiss, or the couple who spent half their night trying to shoo away the boarding house cat determined to curl between them. Wartime intimacy was often equal parts tenderness and slapstick. Still, beneath the awkwardness, there's gravity. That one night often became a memory replayed endlessly in foxholes and factories, fuel for endurance when everything else was stripped away. Two strangers, bound by paper and hope, learning to share a single night as if it were a lifetime. And when the morning whistle blew, the door opened again, and the war reclaimed its hold. You wander now into the strange collisions of culture that these quick marriages created. Picture a northern farm boy with a flat Midwestern accent suddenly finding himself married to a southern belle who says "y'all" with every breath. Or a Brooklyn dock worker swept up in love with a Kansas schoolteacher. War compressed time, and in that compression, regional differences slammed together like boxcars on a rattling train. Here's the mainstream fact: World War II accelerated regional mixing in America. Soldiers were stationed far from home, often for the first time, and met women whose customs, foods, and even slang felt foreign. A marriage could mean not just a new spouse, but a crash course in another corner of the country. And here's your quirky tidbit. One Illinois groom wrote home in bewilderment that his southern bride served grits every morning. "I thought it was mashed potatoes gone wrong," he confessed. Meanwhile, a southern wife admitted she was horrified by her husband's insistence on putting ketchup on everything, including eggs. Marriage became a culinary battlefield as much as an emotional one. Historians still argue whether these unions smoothed out regional divides or deepened them. Did love help stitch together a more unified American identity? Or did it simply paper over frictions that re-emerged after the honeymoon? Some scholars suggest these marriages seeded long-term cultural blending, while others say they created decades of in-law drama. You step into a family kitchen now where your bride's mother insists on biscuits while you ask for toast. The father chuckles, the cousins stare, and you feel like an anthropologist dropped into a domestic experiment. You try to laugh it off, telling yourself, well, if I can face a sergeant, I can face gravy with everything. And of course, humor spills over. Imagine a Brooklyn groom trying to impress his southern in-laws with a drawled "howdy, ma'am" that sounds more like a toothache than charm. Or the Midwestern bride who brings a Jell-O salad to a Louisiana fish fry and is met with stunned silence. These tiny frictions turned into family folklore, told and retold at reunions long after the war ended. Still, the deeper truth lingers. In those hurried unions, cultural maps were redrawn, one kitchen table at a time. You hold your bride's hand across the gravy boat, realizing that love, or at least companionship, requires not just vows, but a willingness to embrace someone else's world, however strange it tastes at first bite. You find yourself now overseas, watching the phenomenon take on an even stranger shape. For many soldiers, whirlwind marriages didn't stop at American borders. They met women in villages, cafes, and bombed-out cities, and vows followed almost as quickly as they had back home. Imagine a GI sipping bitter coffee in a Paris cafe, locking eyes with a French waitress, and before the weekends, promising forever. Here's the mainstream fact. By the late stages of the war, thousands of American servicemen married foreign women. Britain, France, Italy, and later occupied Germany and Japan all saw sudden unions. These marriages often bypassed cultural, linguistic, and even legal barriers, fueled by a mix of adrenaline, loneliness, and the charm of novelty. The quirky tidbit? Some soldiers married women they couldn't even speak to without a pocket dictionary. One famous anecdote tells of a GI who learned the French phrase "je t'aime" before anything else, repeating it constantly until his bride-to-be finally taught him how to ask for bread. Another story recalls a bride who believed GI was her husband's actual first name for months. Historians still argue whether these overseas marriages represented genuine love or wartime opportunism. Were soldiers swept away by true affection, or were they intoxicated by romance, amplified by foreign settings? And for the women, was it passion, or was it a pragmatic gamble on a new life in America? You picture yourself in the ruins of a bombed Italian piazza, holding hands with someone whose laughter bridges the gap your dictionaries cannot. Around you, soldiers whistle and tease, calling her Mrs. Tomorrow. You blush, but you don't let go of her hand, because in that surreal landscape where buildings crumble and the sky seems untrustworthy, holding on feels like rebellion against chaos. The humor glimmers too. Imagine the double takes when a bride shows up in Kansas speaking only halting English, shouting "Buongiorno" at the neighbors who respond with confused nods. Or the bemused GI explaining to his Midwestern mother why her new daughter-in-law insists on serving wine with breakfast. Still, the poignancy cuts through the laughter. These marriages stitch together worlds once separated by oceans and wars. You can almost feel the tremor in your chest as you sign the papers, unsure whether you've married a stranger, a soulmate, or simply a fragment of wartime illusion. Either way, you carry the weight of two nations bound by one weekend's vow. You step back onto American soil, trailing behind thousands of returning GIs, and the cracks in those whirlwind vows start to show. War is over, the uniforms are folded into drawers, and suddenly real life replaces the adrenaline of temporary goodbyes. Couples who knew each other for a weekend now face years together, with mortgages, bills, and babies arriving faster than ration coupons once did. The mainstream fact: after World War II, divorce rates in the United States spiked dramatically. In 1946 alone, over 600,000 couples filed for divorce, a record at the time. Many of those cases involved wartime marriages rushed into under pressure that buckled when the urgency disappeared. Judges groaned under the weight of crowded dockets, and newspapers dubbed it the divorce boom. Here's your quirky tidbit. One judge in Los Angeles reportedly grew so weary of hearing identical stories. We met Friday, married Sunday, regretted Monday, that he could recite the petitions before couples opened their mouths. Another court clerk joked that divorce papers became the second wedding license, issued just as quickly and almost as often. Historians still argue whether the divorce spike proved those marriages were doomed from the start, or whether it simply reflected broader social upheaval after the war. Was it love collapsing under scrutiny, or society itself struggling to reset after years of adrenaline and scarcity? Some scholars claim those unions were never meant to last. Others insist they were scapegoats for a restless, shifting culture. You sit at a kitchen table now, staring at the bills stacked beside a half-empty coffee cup. Your spouse, once a glamorous stranger, now scolds you for leaving muddy boots by the door. You blink, realizing that the battlefield felt easier to navigate than this new front. The romance of urgency has drained away, leaving the awkward grind of daily life. And yes, the humor survives here too. Imagine a husband explaining that his wife didn't realize he snored like a freight train until after the war, too late to reconsider. Or the bride who discovered her groom's only culinary skill was opening canned beans and lamented, "We should have waited until after dinner to get married." Still, beneath the slapstick lies a sobering truth. Wartime urgency had stitched together fragile bonds, and peacetime unraveling was inevitable for many. Yet for others, the struggle forged something sturdier. The divorce spike was real, but so were the marriages that endured, proof that sometimes, even when begun in chaos, love found a way to survive the silence of peacetime. You linger now in the space where scholars sharpen their pens and argue endlessly about whether those weekend marriages were folly or bravery. On one side, critics point to the numbers, the divorces, the scandals, the Monday morning regrets. They argue that love can't be rushed, that marriage requires foundations stronger than a handshake and a train schedule. On the other side, defenders claim the very opposite, that in times of chaos, clinging to another human being, even a stranger, was the truest form of courage. Here's the mainstream fact. Academic studies conducted after the war tried to measure the stability of wartime marriages versus peacetime unions. The results were muddled. Some research suggested wartime couples were more likely to divorce, but other surveys revealed that many of those marriages lasted as long, or longer, than ordinary ones. Data, as it often does, told conflicting stories. And the quirky tidbit? In the 1950s, one psychology professor cheekily assigned his students to interview wartime couples in their neighborhoods. The papers came back so wildly contradictory, half glowing tales of lifelong devotion, half horror stories of annulments, that he scrapped the assignment the next year, muttering, "Love is not quantifiable, apparently." Historians still argue whether wartime vows should be read as reckless gambles or noble sacrifices. Did these couples embody irresponsibility, or did they embody the desperate honesty of a generation who knew time was not guaranteed? Even now, scholars present dueling conference papers, waving charts and anecdotes like rival lawyers, never settling the question. You picture yourself at one of those academic debates, listening to a bespectacled historian thunder, "It was madness," while another fires back, "It was resilience." You chuckle quietly, realizing both might be right. After all, isn't love often both foolish and brave, even without a world war as backdrop? The humor slips in when you imagine a grad student presenting wartime wedding statistics alongside a cartoon of a soldier sprinting with a bouquet. Or when you picture professors earnestly debating whether marriage by shoelace ring qualified as sociologically valid. Academia, with its charts and jargon, sometimes missed the humanity hidden in the absurdity. Still, you sense the bigger truth. These arguments aren't really about soldiers or brides, they're about us, about how humans try to make meaning out of chaos. In the end, whether reckless or noble, those marriages stood as tiny acts of defiance against a world that seemed to be unraveling. And defiance, in its own way, is a kind of love. You shift now toward the stories that refused to collapse, the marriages that, against all odds, endured. Not every weekend vow evaporated under the bright lights of peacetime. Some couples, who met over a cup of bad coffee and a nervous laugh, managed to stretch those hurried beginnings into decades of companionship. Here's the mainstream fact. Researchers later found that a surprising portion of wartime unions did last, often because couples felt their relationship had been forged in fire. Facing separation, fear, and the constant specter of loss, they built resilience early that carried them into calmer years. Newspapers in the 1960s sometimes featured war bride anniversaries, spotlighting couples who had made it 20 or 30 years from a single whirlwind weekend. And, the quirky tidbit, some of these long-lasting pairs had entire family legends built around their hasty start. One couple laughed every year on their anniversary by retelling how the groom had accidentally proposed while sneezing. Another proudly showed their grandchildren the bent brass ring that had survived not just wartime shortages, but half a century of dishwashing and gardening. The absurdity became part of the romance. Historians still argue whether these successes prove the soundness of the institution or the sheer adaptability of humans. Did love really grow out of nothing, or did couples simply learn to tolerate each other because breaking apart wasn't as easy then as it is now? Some scholars call them survivors of circumstance. Others see them as living testaments to the possibility that timing matters less than commitment. You imagine yourself stepping into a cozy living room decades later. The soldier's hair has thinned, the bride's hands are speckled with age, but they still laugh about their first dance, performed in a train station lobby while a janitor swept in the background. Their children roll their eyes, having heard the tale too many times, but you can sense the warmth that radiates from every retelling. Humor hangs around, of course. Picture an old husband teasing, "Marrying you was the craziest thing I ever did," and his wife firing back, "And the smartest." Or the couple who insisted they owed their longevity not to passion, but to the fact that neither of them could cook, forcing them to eat every meal together in diners for 30 years. Still, the tenderness outweighs the jokes. These marriages proved that sometimes love doesn't need careful planning or endless courtship. Sometimes it just needs two people stubborn enough to turn a reckless weekend into a lifetime. And in their laughter, in their bent rings and shared rituals, you see a reminder: not every gamble ends in loss. Some pay off in spades. You step now into the darker corners, where those hasty unions unraveled in scandal and betrayal. For every couple that grew old together, there were others whose promises crumbled faster than ration paper in the rain. Picture a soldier returning home to find his weekend bride already walking arm in arm with someone new. Or a young wife learning that her husband, stationed overseas, had quietly started another marriage in a foreign port town. Here's the mainstream fact. Wartime courts were flooded with annulment requests. Judges often heard petitions that sounded almost identical. We married in haste, discovered incompatibility, request dissolution. Some unions collapsed within weeks, others dragged on in bitter silence until one spouse finally broke. By the late 1940s, whole newspaper columns were devoted to war-related divorce cases, feeding public fascination with the wreckage of love under fire. And the quirky tidbit? In several states, judges grew so exasperated with the volume of flimsy unions that they started nicknaming cases. One Massachusetts judge reportedly labeled his docket Cupid's Hangover. Another, in Texas, declared that half the marriages before him seemed to be wedded to whiskey first, each other second. Court reporters chuckled, though the couples themselves rarely found the humor. Historians still argue whether these scandals reflected personal weakness or structural chaos. Were individuals simply unfaithful, or did the war itself set traps no couple could withstand? Scholars debate whether the very idea of faithful absence was an impossible demand, stretching human bonds beyond what most could endure. You picture the courtroom itself. Creaking wooden benches, a weary judge adjusting his spectacles, the bride dabbing her eyes while the groom stares at his shoes. Behind them, a handful of curious neighbors whisper, waiting to see who'll be blamed. The soldier mumbles that they never really knew each other. The bride admits she only said yes because he was leaving. In the morning, and the gavel falls, erasing a marriage that barely began. Still, even here, humor edges in. Imagine a husband trying to explain that his other wife, overseas, was just a misunderstanding of translation, or a bride whose annulment paperwork accidentally listed her as married to private unknown. Bureaucracy added slapstick to heartbreak in ways that history almost seems too embarrassed to record. Yet the scars lingered. Families gossiped, reputations soured, and the promise of wartime romance curdled into bitterness. And you, sitting quietly in that courtroom, realize that for every fairy tale story retold at golden anniversaries, there were cautionary tales whispered behind closed doors. In the end, these scandals remind you that love in wartime wasn't just reckless or brave, it was also fragile, flawed, and sometimes fatally human. You wander now into the hazy glow of taverns, canteens, and dance halls where liquor often played matchmaker or saboteur. Picture a soldier on a weekend pass, nerves rattling like dice, taking courage in liquid form before kneeling clumsily to propose. In countless wartime stories, alcohol wasn't just an accessory, it was the accelerant that pushed nervous strangers into bold, sometimes questionable vows. Here's the mainstream fact. Alcohol consumption among servicemen spiked during WWII, both overseas and at home. On leave, soldiers crowded into bars and USO dances where drinks loosened tongues and sped up romance. Chaplains quietly complained about beer-soaked weddings, warning that vows exchanged under the influence might not survive the morning after. And the quirky tidbit, one Las Vegas chapel advertised in newspapers, "Sober or not, we tie the knot." The slogan was meant to be cheeky, but judges later grumbled that they were left sorting out the fallout when hungover couples demanded annulments. Another anecdote tells of a bride so tipsy she kissed the best man instead of the groom at the altar, though both men were too polite, or too stunned, to correct her immediately. Historians still argue whether alcohol merely revealed what people already wanted or created reckless decisions they wouldn't have made otherwise. Did wartime stress simply need a lubricant, or did whiskey manufacture entire romances out of thin air? The debate lingers, tangled up with broader questions about how wartime leisure blurred into wartime desperation. You picture yourself at a dance hall, swing music crackling from the jukebox, beer froth staining your uniform collar. A woman laughs at your clumsy footwork, and suddenly between the dizziness of drink and the pull of music, the idea of marriage seems less insane and more inevitable. Tomorrow, you may regret it, but tonight, it feels like destiny. and the humor writes itself. Imagine a groom too hungover to remember his bride's name during the vows, muttering "sweetheart" instead, while the clerk raises an eyebrow. Or the story of a couple who stumbled out of a tavern so determined to wed that they accidentally followed a neon sign to a pawn shop instead of a chapel. Still, beneath the comedy, the truth simmers. War had already unraveled the rules of ordinary life. Add a few drinks and the guardrails fell away entirely. You hold the cold glass in your hand, knowing it's not really the beer that emboldens you. It's the fear of tomorrow, the fear that if you wait, there may be no tomorrow at all. You stroll now into the glittering world of gossip columns and movie magazines where even celebrities mirrored the wartime rush to the altar. Hollywood stars, ball players and crooners made headlines with whirlwind weddings, their faces splashed across glossy covers as if fame itself gave the union's legitimacy. Ordinary couples flipping through magazines in barbershops and five-and-dime stores saw their own impulsive choices reflected in the glitz of stardom. Here's the mainstream fact: celebrity culture during the 1940s thrived on wartime romances. Frank Sinatra married Nancy Barbato before his fame soared, while actors like Mickey Rooney tied the knot with breathtaking speed, sometimes marrying multiple times before the decade ended. The tabloids adored reporting that even stars couldn't resist the urgency of wartime vows. And the quirky tidbit? Some studios actually staged quickie weddings for publicity. One rising starlet was allegedly nudged by her studio boss to marry a returning GI in front of reporters, purely to boost her patriotic image. Meanwhile, newspapers delighted in stories of baseball players proposing between double-headers, as though matrimony were just another game squeezed into the schedule. Historians still argue whether celebrity marriages during WWII influenced ordinary Americans or simply mirrored them. Did people marry hastily because their idols did, or did Hollywood just exploit an existing cultural frenzy? Scholars can't agree, but they concede that movie magazines blurred the line between private love and public spectacle more than ever before. You picture yourself standing in line at a newsstand, eyes skimming headlines. Starlet marries sailor in midnight ceremony. The photo shows her in a dress borrowed from wardrobe, bouquet clutched like a prop, husband grinning as though drafted into a scene rather than a marriage. You chuckle, thinking, well, if the famous can do it, why can't we? The humor sparkles too. Imagine a soldier telling his bride, "We're just like the Rooneys," only for her to sigh, "He's on wife number 3 already, dear." Or the fan who autographed her own marriage license convinced her GI husband deserved to feel like he married a star. Still, beneath the gossip, the influence was real. Celebrity weddings gave ordinary couples a sense of solidarity, a reminder that love, or at least the performance of it, was happening everywhere, from foxholes to Hollywood Hills. And you, caught between the reality of a courthouse vow and the fantasy of silver screen glamour, feel the strange comfort of knowing your own rushed promise is part of a larger script playing across the nation. You step now into the sewing rooms, attics, and basements where wartime brides cobbled together their wedding outfits from whatever scraps they could scavenge. Gone were the satin gowns and long trains of peacetime luxury. Instead, parachute silk, curtains, and borrowed lace became the raw material of makeshift bridal fashion. Here's the mainstream fact: with rationing in full effect, fabric was scarce and expensive. The War Production Board restricted the use of silk, nylon, and other materials, prioritizing them for parachutes, uniforms, and bandages. As a result, many brides improvised. And a 1943 government survey even noted a sharp drop in formal wedding gown purchases, with most women turning to home sewing or renting dresses. And the quirky tidbit? One famous wartime gown was literally stitched from a used parachute, the faint brown scorch mark still visible where the cords had burned during descent. The bride proudly declared she was marrying in victory cloth. Other women borrowed cousins' dresses or patched together outfits from tablecloths, creating a patchwork chic that would horrify a modern bridal magazine, but delighted wartime photographers. Historians still argue whether these creative gowns reflected resilience or deprivation. Were they symbols of patriotic sacrifice, or evidence of how war stripped even personal milestones of glamour? Some scholars say they embodied ingenuity, others insist they revealed how deep shortages cut into daily joy. You picture yourself standing nervously at the altar, your bride wearing a gown that rustles faintly like a bedsheet, her veil pinned together with safety pins. She looks radiant to you anyway, though the hem is uneven and the fabric smells faintly of mothballs. Around you, guests smile not because the outfit is perfect, but because it's proof that even war can't stop ceremony, and the humor ripples through the seams. Imagine a bride tripping on her too-long parachute silk train, nearly dragging her groom down with her, or the proud aunt who donated lace from her curtains, then muttered through the whole ceremony that her living room looked naked. Wartime weddings always seemed one stitch away from slapstick. Still, the dresses carried weight far beyond their fabric. They were symbols that beauty could survive shortages, that vows could be made sacred even in patched gowns and borrowed shoes. You tuck that image away, a bride smiling in a dress that might not survive the laundry, but a love that just might survive the war. You find yourself now in the flicker of flashbulbs where wartime couples preserved their fragile vows on glossy paper. Photographs became both proof and lifeline, evidence that the whirlwind weekend really happened, and a keepsake carried into foxholes, barracks, or factories. Studios near military bases thrived, cranking out wedding portraits with alarming speed, the ink barely dry before grooms tucked them into breast pockets. Here's the mainstream fact. Wartime wedding photography boomed, especially in cities close to bases. Many studios advertised same-day prints, so soldiers could carry photos with them as they boarded trains. Some even offered package deals, 2 8x10s for the families, 4 wallet-sized prints for the soldiers' buddies. Photographs became surrogate spouses pinned inside helmets or taped above bunks. And the quirky tidbit, some couples who couldn't afford a studio simply posed in front of painted backdrops at carnivals or photo booths. One GI was so proud of his bride's picture that he laminated it with cellophane from his rations kit, showing it off to anyone who'd listen. Another bride confessed her only wedding photo had the courthouse janitor lurking in the background, forever immortalized with mop in hand. Historians still argue whether these snapshots truly deepened marital bonds or served as mere talismans of wishful thinking. Did gazing at a photo create intimacy, or did it preserve only the illusion of one? Some scholars suggest the photographs were more powerful than the marriages themselves, icons of what couples wanted to believe rather than what they really had. You picture yourself holding one of those photos, its edges already curling from the damp air of the barracks. In the picture, your bride smiles stiffly in her parachute silk dress while you stand awkwardly at attention beside her. You show it to your bunkmates, insisting, "See? She's real." They grin, slap your back, and tuck it into the endless lore of soldier storytelling, and humor clings like a fingerprint smudge. Imagine a groom so jittery he blinked in every photo, leaving his wife with a stack of portraits where she looked married to a sleepy-eyed stranger. Or the bride who only noticed years later that her veil had been pinned crooked, giving her a lopsided halo. Wartime photos didn't promise perfection. They promised permanence, however blurry. Still, those images mattered. They became anchors in a sea of uncertainty, each photo a small rebellion against distance and death. Even when marriages unraveled, the pictures often survived, tucked into shoeboxes, whispering of a moment when two strangers believed that a weekend was enough to bind forever. You move now into the invisible battleground, the space inside people's minds where longing, guilt, and doubt clashed more fiercely than artillery. Wartime marriages forged in frantic weekends often meant years of separation. Letters helped, photographs helped, but the human heart is a restless creature, and absence gnawed like a rat in the rafters. Here's the mainstream fact. Military psychologists noted skyrocketing levels of loneliness and anxiety among both soldiers and their spouses. The US Army even circulated pamphlets advising couples on maintaining morale through correspondence. Still, countless journals and oral histories reveal that newlyweds struggled privately with suspicion. Was my spouse faithful? Did we rush into this too fast? And with the constant question of whether their marriage was real or just a wartime mirage. And the quirky tidbit. Some soldiers carried pocket Bibles in which they hid not scriptures but tiny photos of their new brides, treating the book like a sacred relic. Others scribbled notes on cigarette papers during lulls in battle, folding them inside helmets until proper mail could be sent. One bride confessed she whispered goodnight each evening to her husband's dog tags dangling on her bedpost as though they could whisper back. Historians still argue whether these coping rituals strengthened bonds or deepened the sense of loss. Were such gestures acts of resilience or desperate substitutes for intimacy that never really existed? Some scholars suggest they reveal human adaptability. Others see them as evidence of marriages that were fragile from the start. You imagine yourself lying in a cold bunk, staring at the ceiling, replaying the single night you shared before shipping out. Was it enough to sustain a lifetime? You write letter after letter, each one half pep talk, half confession. Back home, your spouse sits at a kitchen table, ration book open beside her, rereading your words until the paper phrase. Both of you live in the in-between, tethered but apart, and humour somehow sneaks in. Picture a soldier dreaming of his bride's home cooking, only to receive a package of cookies so pulverized by transport that it looked more like flour. Or the bride who opened a letter describing the most romantic sunset I've ever seen, only to discover the page was smeared with mud, a boot print across the margin. Even love notes weren't immune to slapstick. Still, beneath the jokes, the ache remains. Wartime marriages tested patience in ways peacetime couples could hardly imagine. You feel the weight of that silence, the ticking of days, the soft hum of worry that never stops. And yet the very act of enduring it becomes its own strange form of devotion, a promise kept, one lonely night at a time. You turn now toward the most unexpected outcome of all, children born from whirlwind weekends. For some couples, a hurried night together meant a lifetime of responsibility neither had truly imagined. Imagine a bride discovering weeks after her soldier husband shipped out that she was pregnant, the news arriving like a letter she hadn't expected to receive. Here's the mainstream fact. The wartime baby boom didn't wait until 1946. Even during the fighting, thousands of war babies were born to couples who had met, married, and conceived in astonishingly short order. Hospitals near bases reported surges in deliveries, sometimes noting in records that the fathers were overseas, status unknown. And the quirky tidbit? One army hospital chaplain joked that he could tell which regiments had been stationed nearby based on the names given to babies 9 months later. There were whole clusters of little Douglas, Dwight, and Roosevelt in some towns. Meanwhile, a Kansas newspaper reported a bride who named her daughter Victory Bell after discovering she was pregnant 3 days after her husband's departure. Historians still argue whether these children strengthened bonds or strained them. Did babies anchor couples, giving them reasons to endure the long separations? Or did they magnify the fragility, saddling strangers with lifelong ties forged by chance? Scholars debate whether these war babies were symbols of hope or reminders of reckless haste. You picture yourself writing a letter in the dim glow of a barracks lantern, the words trembling as you try to describe fatherhood from afar. Back home, your bride folds the paper over her swelling belly, whispering your words to the child inside. Months later, she sits in a delivery room alone, clutching the brass ring you left her, praying you'll return to see the child whose life began in a single, hurried weekend. Humour slips in, too. Imagine the confusion of a grandmother explaining to neighbours why her daughter's baby was born barely 7 months after the wedding. Well, she'd sigh, the war moves quickly and so did they. Or the bride who mailed a telegram to her husband overseas that read, simply, "Congratulations, you're a dad. Stop. Baby looks like you. Stop. Mail money, stop. Still, the gravity overwhelms the chuckles. Children turn temporary romances into permanent legacies. Whether the marriages endured or dissolved, those babies carried the proof of wartime choices into the next generation. And you, staring at that newborn's tiny fist curling around your finger, realize that one rushed night has stretched itself into forever. You cross the ocean again, this time into the lives of international war brides, women who left their homelands behind to follow the men they had married in haste. Britain saw the largest wave, with thousands of English women marrying American GIs. But they weren't alone. French women, Italian villagers, even Japanese brides after the occupation, all found themselves boarding ships and planes toward an America they had only glimpsed in newsreels. Here's the mainstream fact: by 1946, over 70,000 British women had emigrated to the US as war brides, followed by tens of thousands from continental Europe and later Asia. The US War Brides Act of 1945 was created specifically to smooth the immigration process, waiving quotas and easing paperwork for military spouses. The cultural impact was enormous, reshaping small towns across America with sudden accents and foreign customs. And the quirky tidbit: one British bride reportedly arrived in New Jersey carrying nothing but a teapot, explaining that she couldn't imagine life in America without proper tea. Another story tells of an Italian bride who tried to smuggle homemade salami through customs, only for the ship's crew to insist on sampling it mid-voyage. These small oddities made headlines, painting the brides as both exotic curiosities and symbols of wartime romance. Historians still argue whether these women were pioneers of cross-cultural exchange or victims of reckless haste. Did they represent boldness and hope, or desperation and naivete? Some scholars insist war brides helped knit together an international post-war order. Others caution that many faced isolation, prejudice, and heartbreak in their new homes. You picture yourself standing on the dock at Ellis Island, watching women disembark with children tugging at their skirts, their accents thick, their eyes scanning for husbands they hadn't seen in months or even years. Some reunions were tearful and joyous, others were awkward, even strained, as reality rarely matched the romance imagined through letters. Humor slipped in as well. Imagine the small-town gossip when a French bride scandalized her new neighbors by strolling into church wearing red lipstick, or the poor Japanese bride who cooked rice every night, only to discover her Midwestern husband thought potatoes were the only respectable starch. Misunderstandings piled up like laundry, sometimes funny, sometimes painful. Still, the sight of those ships docking, of brides stepping into unknown lives, carried a weight larger than individual stories. These women symbolized both the reach of American power and the fragility of human hope. One weekend's promise had stretched across oceans, binding nations together through the most personal and unpredictable of ties. You step into the mountain of bureaucracy that followed these hasty vows, a paper war almost as exhausting as the one fought overseas. Marriage may have been quick, but visas, transport orders, and military approvals were anything but. Couples found themselves shuffling through offices, chasing signatures and clutching envelopes as though they were passports to a new life. Here's the mainstream fact. The US War Brides Act of 1945 eased restrictions, but red tape still loomed large. Thousands of women endured months of paperwork before being allowed to join their American husbands. Shipping schedules, background checks, and immigration quotas created bottlenecks. Some brides waited years, raising children alone in their home countries before finally reuniting with their husbands in America. And the quirky tidbit? In Britain, war brides were issued bride ships, complete with chaperones whose job was to prevent scandal on the voyage. One chaperone complained she felt less like a guardian of morals and more like a cruise director for seasick newlyweds. Another bride recalled filling out so many duplicate forms that she finally signed one Mickey Mouse, just to see if anyone noticed. It sailed through without a question. Historians still argue whether this bureaucracy represented necessary order or heartless delay. Was the government protecting borders or simply drowning hopeful couples in paperwork? Some scholars argue the endless forms tested marriages before they even began. Others suggest the delays weeded out unions that weren't strong enough to endure. You picture yourself hunched at a desk in some drafty embassy office, scratching your name onto yet another form while a clerk yawns. Your bride stands beside you, clutching her papers as if they were life preservers. Around you, other couples mutter anxiously, flipping through manila folders, thick with stamps and signatures. The war may be over, but the siege of red tape is relentless. The humour bubbles too. Imagine a bride whose name was so long it didn't fit on the form, leaving her officially registered as Mrs. Smith, etc. Or a soldier who accidentally listed his birthplace as mess hall because he copied from the wrong line on his discharge papers. Bureaucracy, as always, had a knack for turning solemn vows into paperwork comedy. Still, the weight of those documents cannot be ignored. Each form represented another step toward reunion or another obstacle. Couples learned patience the hard way, tethered not by romance but by rubber stamps. And you, pen in hand, realize that sometimes love isn't tested on the battlefield or the honeymoon, but in the endless corridors of offices where ink, not blood, decides your fate. You drift now into the small towns and neighborhoods where these marriages landed like stones, tossed into still ponds, rippling through communities that suddenly had to adjust their expectations. In quiet villages, whispers spread quickly. Did you hear she married that soldier after only 3 days? In cities, apartment neighbors raised eyebrows at the new bride, lugging her suitcase up the stairs, her husband already gone back to the base. Here's the mainstream fact. Sociologists noted how wartime marriages reshaped community dynamics. Divorce rates rising, war brides arriving, and children born to absent fathers all created shifts in local gossip, church sermons, and even housing shortages. Boarding houses converted rooms for war couples, and towns learned to accommodate the sudden churn of newlyweds with husbands absent for months on end. And the quirky tidbit? Some towns hosted what newspapers called hurry-up honeymoons, offering cheap hotel packages specifically for couples marrying on a soldier's leave. One Iowa innkeeper bragged that his establishment had the shortest average honeymoon in the Midwest, 18 hours, breakfast included. Meanwhile, barbershops offered groom specials, a shave, a haircut, and shoe shine, all bundled for nervous men rushing to the altar. Historians still argue whether communities embraced or merely tolerated these rapid unions. Did they view them as patriotic sacrifices, lending moral support to the war effort, or did they quietly scorn them as reckless choices bound to end in scandal? Evidence suggests both. Church bulletins celebrated new marriages one Sunday, then tutted about separations the next. You picture yourself walking down Main Street hand in hand with your new spouse. Shopkeepers smile politely, but behind counters, whispers stir. Children peer curiously, trying to understand why Mrs. Johnson suddenly has a new last name. At the church picnic, a neighbor mutters, "They barely know each other." And yet others admire your courage, bringing casseroles and congratulations, as though community judgment could swing like a weather vane. Humor, as always, lingers in the corners. Imagine a bride arriving at Sunday service still wearing her parachute silk gown because she hadn't had time to sew another dress. Or a groom asking the local grocer for marital advice, only to be told, "Son, buy more flour." Communities adapted in fits of practicality and absurdity. Still, the social adjustment left marks. These marriages weren't private matters. They became public theatre. Every vow, every goodbye at the train station, every letter read aloud on a porch, woven into the gossip and folklore of the town. You feel the gaze of neighbors, the tug of community expectation, and realize that in wartime America, even the most intimate choices echoed far beyond the couple themselves. You wander now into the twilight years, decades after the war, where veterans look back on their whirlwind vows with a mixture of nostalgia, regret, and wry humor. Old men in VFW halls swap stories over coffee, their medals clinking faintly, their eyes soft with memory. Some grin and say, "Craziest thing I ever did, but it worked." Others shake their heads, muttering, "Should have thought twice." Here's the mainstream fact. Oral history projects in the 1980s and 1990s collected thousands of interviews with WWII veterans, and marriage, especially those sudden ones, surfaced again and again. For many, it remained the defining personal story of their service, even more than battles or medals. The marriages, good or bad, shaped entire lives. And the quirky tidbit? One veteran told interviewers he proposed in less than 5 minutes at a soda fountain, then laughed. "We've been married 50 years, longer than it took to decide." Another joked that he remembered the price of the courthouse license better than his own anniversary. And some men sheepishly admitted they'd forgotten their wives' names on that first night, scribbling them on matchbooks just to keep track. Historians still argue whether these reflections prove the resilience of love or the randomness of survival. Did lasting marriages demonstrate that even reckless beginnings could ripen into lifelong bonds? Or did the veterans who stayed silent, those who divorced or regretted, prove the opposite? The record is skewed as memories soften with time and truth blurs under nostalgia. You imagine yourself sitting at one of those reunions, styrofoam cup in hand, listening to an old comrade retell his wedding day. His voice cracks not with sadness but with laughter. He insists the judge mispronounced his name, that his bride wore borrowed shoes, that the train left before they finished their coffee. And yet he says, "It was enough." The room nods because everyone remembers their own version of enough. The humor bubbles too. Imagine an octogenarian leaning in and confessing, "Son, we only stayed together because neither of us could cook." Or another claiming, "I wanted to divorce her after the war, but she ironed my uniforms too well." These stories, absurd and tender, transform reckless weekends into folklore polished by decades of retelling. Still behind the laughter lies weight, the choices made in a single weekend stretched across lifetimes, shaping children, grandchildren, and entire family trees. You watch the veterans lean back, eyes closed, and realize that whether their marriages lasted or crumbled, the memory of that hurried vow never left them. It was as much a part of their service as the battles themselves. You ease now into the present, where echoes of those wartime weekends still ripple through modern love stories. Some families trace their very existence back to a hasty courthouse vow made in 1943. Others tell cautionary tales of annulments and heartbreak. Either way, the legacy of whirlwind marriages lingers, woven into family law, movies, and even how people talk about love under pressure today. Here's the mainstream fact. Historians estimate that millions of Americans alive today descend from couples who married in haste during WWII. Genealogists note spikes in marriage certificates clustered around bases, shipyards, and transport hubs. For some families, the weekend wedding has become a point of pride, recounted at reunions as proof of resilience. And the quirky tidbit? Online ancestry forums often feature posts from people puzzling over why their grandparents' marriage certificate is dated just 2 days after they met. One man discovered his grandmother's wedding dress was literally borrowed from the neighbor's clothesline, still smelling faintly of laundry soap. Another stumbled across a shoebox of letters revealing his grandfather had proposed before remembering how to spell her last name. Historians still argue what these stories mean for us today. Were wartime unions anomalies born of global crisis, or do they reveal a universal truth that love often thrives under pressure, even recklessly so? Some scholars say the WWII's rush to the altar distorted marriage for a generation. Others suggest it merely highlighted a timeless impulse. When tomorrow isn't guaranteed, you cling to someone today. You sit now with that thought, picturing the threads stretching forward. Children born from those hurried vows grew into parents and grandparents. Some carried traditions of stubborn devotion, others warnings against haste. The echoes remain in every family story told around a dinner table, every faded photo tucked into a scrapbook, every bent brass ring saved in a jewelry box. Humor still peeks through even at the end. Imagine a great-grandchild discovering their ancestor's marriage license filed under miscellaneous because the clerk didn't have time to sort it properly. Or the elderly couple who laughed, "We met Friday, married Sunday, and argued every Monday for 70 years, but we wouldn't change it." And so the tale of soldiers marrying strangers in a weekend becomes less about folly or wisdom, and more about humanity itself, the longing for connection, the absurdity of haste, the bravery of promises made under fire. Now let the pace soften, the lights dim further, the words stretch out like shadows at dusk. You breathe slowly, letting the noise of battlefields and train stations fade into quiet. The clatter of typewriters and courthouse stamps dissolves. In their place remains only the steady hum of memory, softened by time. Imagine those couples, some still laughing together in retirement homes, others separated by years but bound by the ghost of a vow. Their choices, reckless or brave, dissolve now into a gentle blur. Let yourself rest in that blur. The war has ended, the trains have stopped. The hurried footsteps of grooms and brides have faded down the courthouse stairs. What remains is the hush of stillness, the comfort of knowing stories don't need neat endings to matter. They simply need to be remembered. So close your eyes, let the last echoes of brass bands and typewriters drift away, and picture only the calm, two hands reaching for each other across the fog of history, holding on, if only for a weekend.